when anyone tries to measure the consequences of the First World War for our own times and for the rest of the 20th century, we confront three fundamental upheavals that we're still trying to deal with. The first is not well known. It is that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire presented a crisis in Islam, in the Muslim world, since the Ottoman emperor was the caliph, the symbolic head of the Muslim world, in particular the Sunni Muslim world. He was the guardian of the holy sites in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And the multi-ethnic character of the Ottoman Empire had lived for 400 or 500 years without there being a collision between Islam and nationalism. What happened at the end of the First World War was a collision between Islam and imperialism. Now that collision was because the victorious Allied countries intended to carve Ottoman Turkey into sectors of influence or control, where the Greeks would have their part, the Italians theirs, the British theirs, the French theirs, and even maybe the Americans would have some part of Armenia. But in no sense was the Middle East going to be a place where independent nations would exist. Empire survived the First World War in the Middle East. And by doing so, it created a series of puppet leaders, the best known of which is King Farouk of Egypt, but there are many others, who served as agents of Imperial Britain or Imperial France, and whose position was deeply suspect by Muslims of a devout and radical kind. Where was the future of Islam? What would happen to women in the family? Would Shariah, the Muslim law, operate? All of these questions were now unclear and uncertain. And a group of radicals met in the late 1920s in Cairo to do something about it. They created a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And that brotherhood, in due course, spawned the radical groups that assassinated Anwar Sadat in Egypt, the man who made peace with Israel, and who created Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State movement today. There's a direct line between the First World War and the violence going on in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in many parts of the Arab world today. The First World War is where it began, and it was a collision between imperialism and Islam. It's worse today because each of the states in the region are failed states or failing states that cannot control or contain these Islamic populations that keep fighting generation after generation. The second part of the legacy of the First World War for the 20th century is closer to home in Russia. In my view, what happened in the First World War was the creation of a monster state. States in the First World War had power over everybody and everything. They had communications that could allow them to find out about you or your family or your uncle living in the mountains and reach him. The hand of the state was everywhere. The power of the state was everywhere. And in wartime, law became what the state wanted it to be, so anyone could be arrested. Now, this powerful authoritarian state, combined with the brutalization of soldiers who fought for 4 years, the Russian army lost 2 million soldiers in the First World War. And then the casualties were probably of the same order in the Russian Civil War. A brutalized population, a hungry population facing famine in the hands of an authoritarian state is the direct outcome of the First World War. The crimes of Lenin and Stalin could never have happened without the First World War. There would never have been a Russian Revolution without the First World War. And the same is true for Nazi Germany. The monstrous regime that the Nazis created was a direct outcome of German defeat in the First World War, followed up by the weakness of democracy. So the authoritarian character of the Russian 20th century, the crimes of the Gulag, came not out of Russian history, but out of global history. It came out of a global explosion called the First World War, in which states with massive power were able to operate without any legal control. That is why the Armenian genocide of 1915 is a terrible precedent. It showed that the state could do anything. It could eliminate an enemy within. And that enemy within was ethnic. But what if you were to define the enemy within as political, as Stalin did, in which he would kill people of whatever ethnic origin he felt threatened the regime? The First World War is the antechamber, therefore, of the Gulag and of the extermination of Jews in the Second World War. So the terrible consequence of the Second World War is the authoritarian state and the ravages that state imposed upon its own civilians. The third legacy of the First World War that seems to me to be utterly impossible to avoid these days is the creation of a pacifist movement in Europe to create some kind of political institution that would avoid the disaster of the bloodshed of 1914-1918 and of its sequel, 1939-1945. And that pacifist political program is called the European Union. It is a way of organizing power without big armies. Now, European nations spend less of their national budget on armies than ever before. There are smaller numbers of soldiers as part of the workforce of Western European and Eastern European countries in the European Union than ever before. It is a place where, yes, war did break out in Yugoslavia, but in a country conspicuously not part of the European Union, and in a country that remains outside of it because of the consequences of the bloodbath of 1990s in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. So what I think we can see is that the state we all live with enormous power, the ethnic quarrels that we can see, especially in the Middle East, but not only. The Islamic radical hand has extended well into the Russian Republic, from Chechnya or from Georgia or from other parts of the Caucasus. And indeed, the question of Europe and what does Europe mean comes directly out of the First World War. My guess is that the history of the First World War is the best way for students to realize that Russian history is European history. And it started to go wrong in 1914, and it stayed wrong for a long, long time. I want to come to two very specific explosive conflicts that are unfolding today. The first is between Israel and the Arab states around it and the Palestinian population it controls on the West Bank and in Gaza. That conflict is a child of the First World War, where Britain and France gave promises of independence to countries who never received it. The commitment to Zionists was to provide a homeland for Jewish people in the Middle East. Homeland is not a state. They used a lawyer's term, a place where people could live. But it's become a state, and that conflict is unimaginable without the First World War, creating the stage of promising the same land of Palestine to two entirely opposed groups, those who wish to construct an Arab-Palestinian state and those who wish to construct a Jewish state. The second conflict, which shows the hand of the First World War throughout the 20th century, will be seen a little bit later in April 1915, just after this recording. And that is that on the 24th of April, the Armenian population in the Republic of Armenia will follow the Catholicos of their church in canonizing as saints 1 million victims of the Armenian genocide of 1915. This is radically opposed by the Turkish government, and no one knows the outcome of this direct legacy of the First World War.